Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We'll just wait a few seconds to let everyone join the session. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
That's fine. Okay. So I think we can start. Welcome again to this webinar on how satellite-based observations help us monitor greenhouse gas emissions. This webinar is organized by the Horizon Europe projects, Avengers, iClima, and Paris, whose activities or research activities focus on supporting and improving national greenhouse gas emissions estimates using atmospheric observations. This is Lara Chehade from the CMCC Foundation, and I will be moderating this webinar. We have with us Michael Buchwitz. He's a senior scientist at the Institute of Environmental Physics of the University of Bremen in Germany, where he leads the greenhouse and carbon gases group of the Department of Physics and Chemistry of the Atmosphere. We have with us also Professor Dominik Brunner. He's leader of the Atmospheric Modeling and Remote Sensing Group at the Swiss Federal Laboratories for Material Science, Empa in Switzerland. Welcome. Okay, can go through it. So before starting with the presentations, I'm just gonna go through what we do at CMCC very quickly. So we are a research center dedicated to understanding the interaction between climate change and society. We have a network of partners, and we are a nonprofit foundation and a charitable organization. We focus on multidisciplinary analysis to advance climate research. We combine climate modeling with impact assessments and with solutions for adaptation and mitigation solutions. Okay, we operate across 3 multidisciplinary research institutes. The Institute for Earth System Predictions, which focuses on advancing on climate modeling, the Institute for Climate Resilience, which assesses impacts on ecosystem and society to support mitigation and adaptation actions, and the European Institute on Economics and the Environment, focusing on the economic impacts, evaluating the economic impacts of the climate strategies. We have 4 strategic programs exploring frontier topics such as the carbon cycles, the integration of the planetary biochemical industrial carbon cycle to support the transition to a low-emission economy, the Global Cost Program, which work on developing digital twins to explore the cost of phenomena and predicting socioeconomic outcomes in changing climate to support adaptation within policy and investment timeframes. The last one that focused on integrating artificial intelligence and machine learning in the modeling chain to enhance modeling and analyze larger scale data. CMCC hosts also the High Performance Computing Center, which is the most powerful computational facility in Italy. And we have 2 other centers that focus on digital innovation and climate sciences, and one dedicated to capacity building and climate change. So back to our webinar. So you have noticed that your audio and video are disabled. If you would like to ask any question at any time, please use the question and answer section in the bottom of your screen, and we will address all the questions at the end. That's it. With this, I conclude, and I will give the floor to our first speaker, Michael. Just let me. Okay. Stop sharing. Okay. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's fine.
And can you hear me? Good. Okay, yeah, so my name is Michael Buchwitz. I'm from University of Bremen. This will be the first of two talks. I will focus on satellite data. After me, Dominik Brunner from Empa will present part 2, which will be on inverse modeling, but our split will be not one-to-one as shown here. Dominik will also say a little bit about the satellite data, and I will also say a little bit about modeling, how to get emissions. So I have 20 minutes. We both have 20 minutes, and I try to cover this. But this also means that I have to focus on what I can say, and where's no time to go into details. Okay, also shown here are my co-authors from the University of Bremen. So to introduce this topic, I think you all know this. We have increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases that we can observe in the atmosphere, CO2 shown here in the middle in the top, and methane on the bottom in the middle. Time series derived from satellite data. Because these two gases are greenhouse gases, they are the drivers, and important greenhouse gases, they are the drivers for the observed global warming. And the reason for this increase is the imbalance between sources and sinks. So there are several anthropogenic and natural sources and sinks of both gases, and several of them are increasing. And this is the main reason for these increasing concentration. The satellite data I will show you are column averaged dry air mole fractions, so CO2 in ppm and methane in ppb. So this means these are column average mixing ratios or mole fractions. So the average over the entire atmosphere from the surface to the top of the atmosphere, because this is the quantity most of the methane and CO2 satellites can retrieve. This is a little bit more details on the satellite data sets I've just shown you. Observations start in 2003 with the SCIAMACHY instrument on the European Envisat satellite, is then continued with the GOSAT and GOSAT-2 from Japan, and for CO2, OCO2 from NASA. And these data time series, which I show here, are merged time series obtained from the satellite data set that are shown here, which we generate operationally as part of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And we also produce CO2 and methane, these data products in near real time in the context of the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. There are several other satellites which have not yet used for the data shown here, but I will show some examples later. So, for example, Tropomi from Sentinel-5 precursor, and these high spatial resolution hyperspectral imager, Prisma, NMAP, EMIT, and others. So, as already said, this is a kind of a webinar initiated by several EU projects. We from the University of Bremen are part of the iClima project, which is led by Nilu. Our role in this project is evaluation of satellite data and quantification of methane emissions. So we are sitting here in this project, in this box here in the top left, and our focus in this project is methane. And this is one reason why in this presentation I will focus primarily on methane. So there are several reasons also why to focus on methane. So the important role of methane in terms of climate change has also been recognized by politicians. So at COP26, many countries, more than 100, or I think 150 or so, are participating in the so-called Global Methane Pledge, where countries have agreed to try to significantly reduce their methane emissions within a very short period of time. In this context, one needs methane emission information, and there are already several services where satellite observations of methane are already used. For example, there is this IMEO, International Methane Observatory from UNEP, and the corresponding methane alert and response system MARS. But there's also the European Copernicus CAMS methane hotspot service. And of course, these services need reliable satellite data as input. So what are the satellite data? Here are some examples shown. So what one really would need is detailed methane information in terms of temporal resolution, for example, hourly, spatial resolution, a few 10 meters, etc., global, every day, day and night, looking through clouds. All this is not currently possible. So what is currently possible is to use a mix of satellites to address different aspects. For example, the Stropomi instrument on the Sentinel-5 precursor satellite has a single ground pixel resolution of 6 kilometers. And if there are strong methane sources at here, for example, over the Permian region in the US, you can pinpoint and detect individual emission sources. So this instrument gives the global overview and is able to provide information on very strong methane sources. On the other hand, there are instruments such as NMAP, which have very high spatial resolution, 30 meters, but cannot observe the globe globally, but have to look at specific targets which have to be predefined, and then can generate, and from this data, these maps of atmospheric concentrations can then be retrieved, and the resolution here is so high that you can pinpoint to the location of the individual emission sources. So each of these dots that is shown here in this atmospheric concentration map or methane enhancement map, behind each of the single dots is a radiant spectrum from which this information is retrieved. So the satellite is not sending us down directly methane information, but radiances, and these atmospheric concentrations are then retrieved from these radiances and then can further be used to obtain emission information. So how do these satellites do this? The satellites that I will talk about are all similar as this NMAP satellite shown here in this graphics. So the satellites basically look down, so they observe all reflected solar radiation down looking down from the satellite, looking a little bit to the left and to right to get coverage. So what the satellite measures is this reflected solar radiation, and there are across. If this is the flight direction of the satellite, there are several ground pixels across track. The number depends on the satellite, and behind each of these ground pixels, there is an entire spectrum of radiances, as indicated here with these rainbow colors, from which the methane absorption and/or CO2 information is derived. So we are dealing with several levels of data products. So what the satellites sends us down from space to ground basically are raw data. These are detector signals, temperatures, angles of mirrors, etc. These data are then calibrated to obtain a first data product. This is the level 1 data product. These are calibrated and geolocated radiances. I show here on the top right examples how these radiances look like. So on the x-axis here you have wavelengths, and on the y-axis the radiance, and all the lines you see, these are absorption lines of different gases, CO2, methane, water, whatever. And if there would be no gas in the atmosphere, you would not see these lines. So each gas has a certain very specific fingerprint. So from these lines, you can say, okay, this is water, this is a methane. We know this from laboratory measurements, for example. And the deeper the lines are, so the more is absorbed, the more of this gas is present. So from these radiant spectra, we can retrieve how much of a specific gas, for example, methane, is along the light path that is observed by the satellite. So from these radiant spectra, which are our main input, we apply so-called retrieval algorithms to retrieve level 2 products. These are atmospheric concentrations for each single satellite ground pixel. And for this, there are different methods how to do that. What we basically typically do is you model the radiant spectrum using so-called radiative transfer models, and then you adjust parameters of these models until you get a good fit of the modeled radiance to the observed radiance. And this gives you then these methane concentration maps. So as I said already, each of these points here is basically a spectrum from which this information is derived. So then you have this level 2 product, the atmospheric concentration, and this is then used or can then be used to derive emission information. For this, you need additional information, for example, on wind speed. And there are different methods how to do that. In the second talk, Dominik will present one method, which can also be used then to obtain regional information or even global information. I will focus here on more simple methods, mass balance method, to obtain information from these kind of plumes that are shown here. And this inversion step then is basically the processing from level 2 to level 4. So it produces from the atmospheric concentration emission information. This is a little bit more detail on the retrieval algorithm. So on the step to generate the atmospheric concentration information, because of limited time, I cannot really go into details here, but many algorithms consist mainly of 3 processing steps: pre-processing, main processing, and post-processing. Pre-processing means read all the input data and maybe do some filtering to identify, for example, clouds, cloudy scenes where processing, high-quality processing will not be possible. Then there's the main processing step. This is the step that basically extracts the concentration information from the radiant spectra. Here's one example where the dots are the tropomi radiances, and the solid line, the black line here, is a model. So in this case, methane absorption, water absorption, and CO absorption is fitted to the spectrum. And as you can see, with this model, it's possible to get a very good fit. And the scaling factor for these absorption structures basically tell us then how much methane is in the atmosphere below the satellite. So this gives us then the atmospheric information. From this, we do the level 2 to level 4 processing, which means take the atmospheric concentration and determine what the emission is. So what's shown here are methods to obtain emission information from plumes, so emission plumes like the ones I've just shown you. There are different methods how to do that. For example, this integrated mass enhancement IME method is a very popular one, but we in Bremen use the cross-sectional flux method, which is basically based on estimating the emission by integrating the column enhancements in terms of tons CO2 per square meter, for example, along transects vertical to perpendicular to the plume direction. So if you integrate that and multiply that with wind speed, you get the emission in, for example, tons per hour. So here are some examples from the tropomi retrieval. So the ones I presented at the beginning, which have this relatively low spatial resolution of about 6 kilometers. We analyzed a first data product that we generated and looked at the emissions using this cross-sectional flux method over several oil and gas fields. And my colleague Oliver Schneising, who did that, not only estimated the emissions from these oil and gas fields, but also computed leakage rates. And this is very important because burning of natural gas or methane compared to coal in terms of CO2 emission per unit energy produced so burning methane compared to coal is only better if the leakage of methane is very low, just a few percent. Otherwise, this so-called climate benefit of burning methane instead of coal is lost, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so a small fraction that leaks into the atmosphere has already a large impact, depending on time scale. And we also analyzed, once we had these first several years of this data set, we looked at 4 years of data in this study here of Vanselo et al., published last year, where we looked at 4 years of data, of these topomi data, and tried to find out where are quasi-consistent, or where are regions where methane is consistently elevated compared to the surroundings. So here are some examples of these oil and gas fields, Permian, Madrid landfill, other cases, and mostly anthropogenic sources, but also natural ones like these elevated methane over the Sudan wetlands, for example. And we have identified in this 4-year time period 217 so-called potential persistent source regions. The top 10 are discussed in detail in this publication. So if you're interested, please have a look. Now I would like to move to these high spatial resolution sensors. These are examples here from the EMIT sensor, which has a spatial resolution of 60 meters. So with this sensor, you really can pinpoint to the emission source. Sometimes it is relatively clear, for example, here in this figure on the left. But there are also cases where the emission plume is not as nice as shown here, but more blob-like. So it's then a little bit more difficult to really pinpoint to where the emission exactly is coming from. So this depends on the meteorological situation, if methane emissions are accumulated over a longer time or not. And so we analyze these data to identify where, if methane is locally elevated, and then we use our cross-sectional flux method to derive the emission estimates. And as I already said, there are different methods how to do that, how to get atmospheric concentrations, for example, from the radiance measurements. We are currently investigating in detail 3 methods. A very popular method, also used by many others, is the so-called matched filter method. And our preliminary analysis also shows that this method gives quite good results in terms of minimization of artifacts. And first results have been published in this iClima technical report, which is available on the iClima website. So if you're interested, have a look. Focus here was on European sources, for example, landfills or coal mines. And you can see in this report what we have detected in terms of emission plumes and estimated emissions. So this report contains tables such as the ones shown here for landfills, where we compare our emission results for these landfills with estimates done by others. And typically, as you can see here, agreement between these different methods is quite good. The emission information, as I said, has to be reliable. So one has to also do something to compare, kind of validate the results. In this context, we are participating in the ongoing Stanford, Michigan controlled release experiment, where the teams from these universities release known amounts of methane. So this is a single blind test. For example, for the results shown here, we and other teams have submitted our emission estimates to Stanford in April, and then once all teams have submitted their emission estimates to Stanford, Stanford has released the true emission information a month later, so that I can make this plot here. This shows that the emission estimates are quite good. You see large scatter here, but this is the emissions here that have been released are pretty low. They are essentially close to the detection limit of these sensors that are used here. I've not said a lot about CO2, so Dominik in the following talk will say a little bit more about that. Also, he will say a little bit more about the CO₂ mission. We in Bremen started already 15 years ago or so to think about how to make better satellite measurements of CO₂ in the future. We proposed the CarbonSat mission to ESA, and this is now implemented as the so-called CO₂ mission from Copernicus. CO₂ will be basically a constellation of 3 satellites. First launch will be 27 or early 28. It will have a swath width of 250 kilometer, ground pixel size of 2 by 2 kilometer, and will not only measure CO₂ and methane. So our idea at that time was very similar. Do these type of measurements so that you can detect emission plumes of localized sources. And now there are lots and lots of papers and activities showing plumes from various satellites. But when we proposed this mission, this was not present. So in our first publication, we could not show any plume from satellite, but had to show that from aircraft data. So a lot has happened in the last 15 years with respect to satellite observations of CO₂ and methane plumes to get information on point sources. And with that, this is the last slide of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Michael. So again, a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question or some comment, just place them in the question and answer box. Can we move on? Dominik.
Okay, so welcome also from my side. It's very nice to see so many people attending this webinar, and thanks, Michael, for introducing the satellite retrievals and what we can do with satellites so nicely. So in my second part, I will combine satellite observations with atmospheric transport modeling to estimate emissions, and I will move away mainly from this point source scale that Michael addressed, more to larger scales in this presentation. And I would like also to thank my co-authors. So Michael has shown some examples of satellite observations. Well, there's already a lot of satellites measuring greenhouse gases. The figures here you can find here under this link or created by the CEOs. And it includes past satellite, present satellites, and also future satellites. And it includes so-called facility scale plume monitors, so satellites targeting individual sources, to global greenhouse gas mappers. And I will mainly focus here on this upper part of satellites, and specifically I will show examples of what we do with observations from the Sentinel-5P satellite, so the TROPOMI instrument, and also from the CO₂ satellite, and also give an example of what we of model simulations we did for CO₂. Well, when we combine satellite observations with atmospheric transport models, we don't look just at annual mean maps. Often you see from TROPOMI or so nice maps of global maps of annual mean methane. But when we combine that with atmospheric transport models, we need to look at individual orbits, satellite orbits. And here is just an example of how such data from a single satellite orbit or a single day from TROPOMI looks like. So you see that there's a lot of gaps because of clouds, and you see also maybe some artifacts. There seems to be some stripes in the data. And if you go to CO₂, it looks even worse because CO₂ has a very narrow swath. So it looks essentially down underneath the satellite, but not so much to left and right. And here's just the satellite data you get sampled over a few days. And yeah, that's from the high resolution images that Michael showed. When they fly over, they can create such an image of a plume. But this is the data we typically work with in our modeling. And now just one slide on atmospheric transport modeling. Most of you are very familiar with that, but for those are not. So what we do, we numerically integrate equations of motion and chemistry on a grid. In our case, we actually run a numerical weather prediction model that computes the meteorology, but at the same time, we also transport chemical species like methane and CO2 in this model. So here, this box, just a sketch of the processes that we represent in such a model. So in a single grid cell, we account for sources, for sinks. We account for the transport by the wind from a neighboring grid cell into this grid cell or the transport out. And also these wiggly arrows represent turbulent mixing that also transports between the individual grid cells. And if you formulate this just mathematically, we actually solve in each grid cell such a continuous equation that should to estimate the change of the concentration of a species I due to chemistry, due to transport, due to sources and sinks. And we don't solve this just on a single grid cell, but actually we solve this on a three-dimensional grid. And in our case, we use the icon model, which has a special grid, this triangular grid. And we can run the model globally, but we, in our group, we mostly run it on a regional scale, for instance, over Europe. And if we integrate numerically, we can compute the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, as shown here. And I'm showing now an animation of a simulation performed by ECMWF, a global CO2 simulation produced with such a transport model. So you see the CO2 moving around in the atmosphere. So if we look at the concentrations, it's not just a reflection of the emissions, but it's the combination of emissions of sources and sinks and the transport in the atmosphere due to weather systems. So it's a fairly complex relation between emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere. And so that's the first component in inverse modeling is that atmospheric transport model. The second component is observations. And in our case, it's satellite observations. And I'm here now showing an animation of how the satellite samples this concentration field. So this is, too fast. So this is a single orbit of CO2M satellite. And while it is orbiting the Earth in a so-called synchronous orbit, the Earth is rotating once in a day underneath, so that the satellite samples different parts of the globe. But you see there's a lot of gaps in between, and that's why we also suggested to have more than just one satellite. So actually, we will have 3 satellites represented by these 3 colors here. And so we will sample CO2 along these satellite observations. And so now we come to inverse modeling. So the atmospheric transport models, they produce so-called forward simulations. So we start from emissions. We take those emissions into the atmosphere, transport forward in time to estimate the concentration distribution of the concentrations in the atmosphere. In inverse modeling, we actually start from atmospheric concentration measurements, for instance, at such a nice site as Jungfraujoch here, and we compare those observations with the model simulated concentrations at the same locations from the forward model simulation. And we will find differences between the simulation and the observations. And in the inverse modeling, we ask the question, so what emissions actually would best fit to the observed concentrations given the atmospheric transport that we simulate with a model? So, and this is an inverse model, an inverse problem that we typically solve with a Bayesian optimization. And now here, so we try to find a vector of emissions x that minimizes this cost function, which has 2 terms. The first term compares the model simulated concentrations, that's these m times x. So the model simulated concentrations, when we start with the emissions x, we compare those with the atmospheric concentrations represented by y here. So we look at the difference between the 2. That's the first term that we want to minimize. And the second term is a normalization term. So we start with an a priori knowledge of the emissions. So we have some first knowledge where the emissions occur and how much, and we don't want to have solutions which are too far away from the a priori. So we solve this, we minimize this cost function and try to find the x, the emissions that minimizes both the sum of the two terms. So we don't want to we want to be as close as possible to the observations, but at the same time not be too far away from the a priori. So that's a little bit an introduction, and I'm now coming to 3 examples of simulations that we did at Empa. And the first one is from a study we did a long time ago in an ESA project, SmartCarb, CO2 simulations to support the design of the CO₂ satellite. So what you here see is actually a CO2 distribution simulated by our model. The white is the model is the clouds, and we simulated at 1 kilometer resolution, and we tried to mimic what the future satellite would see by actually sampling our model simulated concentrations along such a satellite overpass and adding realistic noise. So the 3 elements we put into our simulations is, first of all, atmospheric CO2 simulations at 1 kilometer resolution and also of NO2. And then we performed satellite orbit simulations, so simulating how the satellite would fly over the globe and to fly over this region around Berlin. And then we added measurement noise, actually using a parameterization developed by Michael Buchwitz. And from that, we get simulated concentrations of CO₂ so that was in our model world. We mimic what future satellites would see with clouds and with a realistic noise of the instrument. And then we can do a next step. So that would be like the simulated level 2 product that Michael showed. And from there, we can go to a level 4. So trying to estimate emissions, for instance, here from the Jenschwalde, which is a power plant, or from the city of Berlin, which is a city, as you know. And this data set has been actually used in many publications. So a lot of groups have used this data set to further develop their methods. So level 4, so emission estimate methods, and the data set is also published. So this was how we actually started in my group doing CO2 simulations. And then in the next step, we went further to doing actually inverse modeling, so comparing simulated CO2 concentrations with actual observations. And that was something we have done in the EU project COCO2. So the goal here was to estimate the CO2 fluxes over Europe from both ground-based observations and from the CO2 satellite observations for a single year. And we wanted to estimate at the same time anthropogenic CO2 emissions and the exchange of CO2 with the biosphere. So we performed, in this case, not with Cosmo, but with IconArt, CO2 simulations over Europe. Of course, we put anthropogenic CO2 emissions into the model, and we simulated the exchange with the vegetation with a model, so accounting for ecosystem respiration and photosynthesis. And because we simulate only a regional domain, we also need to account for the amount of CO2 transported into our domain. And from that, we use output from a global model simulation of CO2 to define the CO2 concentrations at the domain boundaries of our simulation. And then we performed inverse modeling using the carbon tracker data assimilation shell, which is using an ensemble square root filter. I will give a few more details later. So here, in a very simplistic way, how this works. So instead of simulating one single CO2 tracer, we actually simulate a large ensemble of 300 CO2 tracers, and each represents the transport of CO2 from a perturbed representation of the emissions. So here is our model domain, and here you see an example of the random scaling factors that we apply to perturb the emissions. So they are centered around 1, but in some regions we increase the emissions, in other regions we decrease the emissions for each tracer. So here you see a loop over the first 50 ensemble members of our simulation. And then instead of then we compare these simulated traces with the atmospheric concentration. So here's an example of a time series. Black is the observations, and red is the prior simulation. And actually all the thin red lines are the 300 different CO2 traces that we simulate. And now the goal is to find one representation of the emissions that better matches the observations. So in the end, with the inversion algorithm, we obtain an optimized scaling factors. So what you see here, that the optimization tells us that the emissions over this region should be reduced, over this region here it should be increased to better match the observations. And I'm just showing here one example of a comparison of simulation with measurements at the Beromünster Tower, which is a large tower in Switzerland where we measure CO2 since 2012. Black is the measured concentrations, and now we have the blue line is the prior run. So when we put into the model our prior knowledge of emissions, and red is the optimized emissions. You see that the red line is closer to the observations. For instance, here there's rather large differences, but also here. So after adjusting the emissions, we get a better representation. But we do not only optimize emissions, but also background concentrations. So we don't fully rely that the CO2 transported through the model domain boundaries is correct, but we also correct the amount of CO2 that is transported into the model domain, which is kind of the large-scale CO2 background, which we also optimize. So that was a comparison with ground-based observations, but now I'm showing a comparison with the OCO2 satellite observations. So here you see all OCO2 observations over our model domain of a full year. And the colors show how different our model simulation is from the observation. So when we see red, our model is higher. And when you see blue, the model was lower. So and in a scatter plot, it looks like this. Now, the right-hand side shows the results when we do this optimization, when we correct background concentrations and your emission fluxes and the natural sources and sinks, then we get a better match. Now we actually performed not only one single inversion, but 4 different ones. So here's just some technical details of the inputs, like we used the TNO inventory for the CO2. We simulated biospheric fluxes using the BPRM model. We used in situ observations from the ICOS OBSPEC and so on. The 4 simulations that we performed are shown here. In 2 simulations, we assimilated only surface observations. In 2 other simulations, we assimilated both surface and OCO2 observations. And then we optimized either only anthropogenic and natural fluxes, or we estimated 3 different quantities: anthropogenic emissions, ecosystem respiration, and photosynthesis separately. And now, how robust are the results when we compare the different inversions? So that's why we performed these different inversions, was to learn about how sensitive the results are to different settings. So for instance, here you see the results when we use only ground-based observations. And what you see here is the scaling factors for anthropogenic emissions. So what the figure shows us actually that apparently the prior emissions are underestimated in this part of Germany, but overestimated in this part of Germany. So we need to reduce the emissions here, but need to increase them here. And this pattern is rather consistent between the different inversions. So you see here this over Germany, there's relatively good consistency. But when we look at France, for instance, we see very different results. So here in this inversion, when we assimilate OCO2 observations, we get a large reduction of the anthropogenic emissions, whereas in this inversion, we get an increase. So and we can aggregate it for individual countries. Here you see example for many different countries, and I'm just focusing on two. So we saw before for Germany, we get relatively good consistency. The gray bar is the prior anthropogenic emissions from the TNO inventory, and the 4 different colors are the 4 inversions. So the orange line, for instance, is the one where we assimilated only ground-based observations, and we optimized only anthropogenic and natural fluxes. And they agree relatively well within the uncertainties of the individual inversion. There's also negative bars here, down here. That's the net biosphere uptake. So how much carbon is stored actually in the soils and in the vegetation. And there the agreement is much worse. So one inversion says there's no uptake, another one says there's even an increase. But for Germany, they all agree within the uncertainty bars. But for France, we get fairly inconsistent results. There's one inversion, this one here, where the uptake by vegetation is as large as the anthropogenic emissions here. And the problem here really is that the net biosphere uptake is the difference of 2 large numbers. So there's a large amount of respiration, which is shown here for the example of France. So anthropogenic emissions from France are 380 megatons per year. Respiration, so from vegetation over the years, 2,380. Photosynthetic uptake is minus 2,860. And the net is here the difference between the two. And it's always difficult when you have 2 different numbers, 2 large numbers, when you take the difference that you get something reliable. And that's something we see here, that this is really difficult. When we assimilate in situ observations, we get different results from satellite. And when we change our inversion setup, we also get some different results. So the last example I'm showing here is from a project Smart CH₄, where we looked at methane emissions over Romania. And we selected this country especially because there's a lot of oil and gas production in this country, and we wanted to learn more about the emissions from that. So again, we performed inverse model simulations, now at a fairly high resolution of 3 kilometers over Romania. We simulate 2 domains as shown here. And we specifically looked at the emissions from the oil and gas sector. And down here is actually each black point is the location of an oil or gas well. And we tried to specifically look at emissions from those sectors. And what we did here, we did not only use one single satellite, Tropomi satellite product, but there's actually different groups that have produced different level 2 products from Tropomi. The SRON, which is the operational product. There's WFM DOAS from the University of Bremen, so Michael Buchwitz group, and then a blended product which uses also GOSAT observations to correct Tropomi data from Harvard. Here's an example of the comparison of Tropomi observations averaged over a month over Romania. So that's the total columns of methane over Romania. This white area is actually the mountain region of Romania, where the satellites doesn't produce good observations and are filtered out therefore. And this is our model simulated. There's quite some resemblance, but not perfect match, of course. We can look at the statistics on the right-hand side here. So each red dot here shows the direct comparison of a single Tropomi satellite pixel with our model simulated concentration. And you see that the red line is our prior, so we generally underestimate the concentration. But after optimization of the emissions, we get the blue points, which agree much better with the observations. And we see that also in the scatter plot. Actually, the red is the scatter plot between Tropomi and our ICANN simulations from the prior, the red, and when after optimization, we get a better fit. But it's still not perfect, of course. There's also a lot of noise in the satellite observations. Now, the problem here is now that when you look at the 3 different products, that's always the same monthly average. You see that there's quite significant differences between the different products. VFM DOAS has more data than the others. They have a less strict cloud filter and topography filtering, and so we get much more observations from VFM DOAS than from the other two products, but maybe also some with some noise. And yeah, here the blended and SRON product have different levels. So the blended product has lower columns than SRON. And now when we put these data sets into our inverse model, that's what we get. So we get, again, these scaling factors that tell us how much we should increase or decrease the emissions over a certain region. And there's some regions where we find consistent results between the inversions. For instance, here we estimate lower emissions over this part and higher over this part. But you see large differences in other regions. For instance, when we assimilate SRON product, we estimate that actually emissions over the southern part of Romania should be increased. Here with VFM DOAS, we get an increase over Transylvania, and here we get a large decrease over this eastern part of Romania. So it looks better when we look at country totals. These are the country total estimates for 2019 from the different satellite products. The black line is the a priori, and the bars show the total country emission estimates for the three Tropomi products, which differ by something like 200 kilotons, so maybe about 20%. They are all lower than the prior, but maybe what we thought that when we take one single product like the SRON and compare 2 different years, maybe we get some more reliable results. Because if SRON has if the product has some biases, maybe the biases are similar in different years. So maybe when you look at trend, you get more reliable results. And we see a decrease of 26% over 2 years, which is a large reduction. There's actually indication also from another study that methane emissions have indeed decreased over Romania. There were a study Romeo in 2019 measuring methane emissions from oil and gas production, and then later in 2021 another study with aircraft-based measurements, which indicated that there was a substantial decrease from the oil and gas production region. But whether that really agrees with our estimates here, we still need to analyze a bit more. So to summarize, what we are the challenges we are facing with inverse modeling, that is that satellite observations have not only random uncertainties, but also some systematic errors, and those are fairly difficult to characterize. So if columns are too high over one region and too low over another region, our inversion tries to compensate that with emissions. And another issue is that, well, you saw significant differences between the 3 Tropomi products, and obviously they cannot all be consistent with the ground-based observations. So when we combine ground-based observations with satellite observations, maybe we need to account also for biases between the different products. And I showed that estimating net biospheric CO2 fluxes from satellites is really challenging, especially at the regional scale that we are looking at. One issue is that it's a difference of two large contributions. So in winter, we have mainly respiration, a large positive signal, and in summer, photosynthesis, a large negative signal, and the annual mean is then the difference between the two. And one problem with satellites is that there's a seasonal sampling bias. So in winter, we have less observations because there's more clouds and less favorable conditions than in summer. And that can create some problems. And there's also a very nice discussion of maybe the current state of satellite observations of CO2 in this publication, where several global models were assimilating CO2 observations. I think what we now found in our results, and also looking at others, is that we think that source and sink budgets are quite getting reliable if you look at large regions, so entire continents like Europe or US, and maybe also they are good in terms of long-term trends, something we want to investigate a bit more. But if you go to country scale, there are still very large uncertainties from these satellite-based inverse estimates. But I'm sure things will improve. One reason is the upcoming satellites will provide better coverage at higher resolution, and also the quality of the CO2 and methane retrievals has really evolved enormously over the past, so let's say 20 years. We have much better observations today, and I'm sure this will continue. And also in terms of our modeling systems, they are continuously improving in terms of the quality, resolution, and also how fast we can simulate. And now I'd like to thank my team and you for listening. And I hope we have some time for answering questions.
Thank you, Dominik. We're running a little bit late, but we still have 5 minutes to answer the questions. Okay, I'm gonna read them out loud. So Abdelaziz, can we have the PowerPoint of the presentations? Because there's a lot of interesting information. Well, actually, the presentations are recorded and they will be made available on the
Yes.
on the website, on the CMCC website, and the YouTube channel. So this is a question for Mikhail. The satellite is giving the column average absorbance. How it differentiates tropospheric and stratospheric ozone? For Gen-Z.
Okay, so I've not said anything about ozone. So what we retrieve is the total column. So basically the mass or the number of methane molecules per area from the ground to the top of the atmosphere. So we count everything, troposphere, stratosphere. The satellite observation have only limited capability to separate, to provide altitude resolution. So we mainly focus on getting a single number, which is the integral over everything. And we do not separate troposphere and stratosphere, but only get the total amount.
And maybe to add to that, in our models, of course, we try to also integrate over the whole atmospheric column. So if our model stops at maybe 50 hectopascal, we add methane on top of that to the top of the atmosphere from another global model, so that we also have a total column. But the representation of the stratosphere is really a critical thing. So we know that models are not always very good in representing stratospheric methane, for instance, and that can create some biases in the models that we need to correct for.
Okay. Another question, how representative are the satellite-derived greenhouse gas retrievals of the air-sea interface? And this is for Michael, I think, and whether you are aware of any efforts in validating greenhouse gas satellite data with marine observations.
So in our validation efforts, we mainly compare with ground-based observations, either from fixed stations or from ships or whatever, that measure the same quantity that we retrieve from the satellite. So this is this XCO2 or X-methane, so the column average mixing ratios. There are networks that do that. For example, primarily the total column carbon observing network, TCON. This is 20 or something station around the globe. They measure exactly what we do with the satellite, but just up looking instead of down looking. So this is our main validation network. There are other data networks under development or that already exist quite substantially. This is the KUKA network, for example. And so if there are measurements, so typically we compare with measurements which can be compared one-to-one because it's the same quantity. If we compare with other observations, for example, in situ observations or so, then this comparison is mostly indirectly. So as Dominik said, observations can be assimilated into models, and then kind of in situ observations can be converted after assimilation into the quantity we measure, and then we can compare. But for example, if there are measurements directly at the air-sea interface in a situ measurement, just very locally, it's difficult to compare directly with our observations because our observations are column averaged and one has to do something to compare this. And we typically compare with data that can be directly compared.
Thank you. The question to Dominik. The OCO2 comparison was done with optimization using OCO2 data or surface stations from the run you showed before. And if OCO2 data was used for optimization, did you use surface data as well?
Yes, so in these simulations, we don't have an inversion where we only used OCO2, but only the two combined. So that would be another experiment where we assimilate only OCO2 observations. But certainly when we assimilate only surface in situ observations, we actually see a strong improvement in the comparison with in situ measurements. Which is much less when we assimilate OCO2 also. So which indicates that there's not a full consistency between the satellite and the ground-based observations, which can come from actual measurement differences, systematic differences in the measurements, but it could also come from our model that maybe the vertical column in our model is not fully consistent with ground-based concentrations in the same way as in reality. So that maybe we overestimate CO2 in the stratosphere, for instance. But that causes some issues. I hope that answers the question.
And did you test using just OCO2 observations in the inversions?
No, yeah, that's just what I said.
Yes,
but
that's
certainly something that would be useful. Yeah.
Okay, and then could you comment on the agreement of satellite results with national greenhouse gas inventory figures? And
yeah, there's a lot one could talk about that. What we see is that when we estimate at the same time the biospheric uptake and the anthropogenic emissions, we see that the assimilation primarily corrects the biospheric part and not so much the anthropogenic amounts. So indicating that the sensitivity to anthropogenic CO2 is smaller than to the biospheric CO2. Biosphere has rather large amplitude emissions uptake during daytime, during summer, and release during winter, and it's widespread. So vegetation is everywhere, whereas anthropogenic emissions are only over cities and along lines and so on, along streets. So overall, it's very hard to determine anthropogenic CO2 emissions from the satellite observations. That's also why I think we need a satellite such as CO2M that will provide a lot more observations, and maybe also auxiliary observations of radiocarbon or some other traces that help us distinguish between biospheric and anthropogenic CO2.
3 minutes after the deadline. Okay, but there are still many questions. I'm gonna take them actually. So someone was wondering about differences between SRON and the tropomi methane inversion results, WFMD. And since they produce noticeably different posterior emission corrections in several regions, are there any independent data set that can be used to validate which one is more accurate? For example, could ICOS eddy covariance flux measurements be useful for this comparison?
Yes, that could be useful. Unfortunately, Romania is a country that has no such measurements at the moment. But in the IMCA project and also in a Swiss-Romania collaboration project, we are actually about to establish some measurement infrastructure over Romania that hopefully will provide some further insights into this. So over other regions, we could do much better comparisons, but unfortunately, Romania is a data sparse region where we cannot, at the moment, we don't know what is kind of the reality. I think we certainly see these differences between the satellites, and it's not just in inversion results, it's already by looking by eye at the satellite columns, you see these differences, which then mirror in the emission uptakes. And I think the first thing is that we need to better understand these differences between the satellite products and reduce them.
Okay, the two last questions. So when determining surface fluxes, so heat, moisture, CO2 from models, we often focus on correcting satellite retrieval biases, but the models themselves also introduce important limitations.
Yeah.
Oh no. So below is a clear structured summary of what typically needs improvement in models to enhance determination of surface fluxes. So I think this was a comment.
Not sure I fully got it. Maybe it's more a comment. I mean, we certainly know about limitations of our models,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's dangerous to assume that the only thing that is not correct in the model is the emissions. So we are trying to also better account for model uncertainties by maybe running ensemble of model simulations. Because assuming that only the emissions are wrong, but maybe the atmospheric transport is 100% correct is a dangerous thing. But it's something we typically do, but I think the community is trying to improve that by running maybe ensembles of models, and in our own model, we can also run an ensemble of metrologies, which already gives some better indication of uncertainties related to atmospheric transport.
Okay. And the last question, how large is the posterior OCO2 model measurement mismatch compared to the OCO2 measurement noise? Did you say that?
I think that's a good question. Not sure whether my figures. Yeah, actually, when I look at the posterior discorrelation plot, the scatter is of the order of 1 ppm, which is, I think, pretty close to the measurement uncertainty of OCO2. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the speakers and thank you for the audience. And I conclude and hope to see you all soon in our next webinar, maybe 6 months from now. And have a nice afternoon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.